Hey y'all, welcome back to CFB Picks. Today we're talking Week 3 football for Penn State versus Auburn. Both teams looking pretty strong against lower level FBS opponents last week, which gives us some good data to work with. Since, as you probably saw in my first video, I was off by quite a bit with my pick for the PSU Ohio game. If you haven't checked that out, take a look at it. It's really hard to model these games when you only have 1 week's worth of data, that being the Penn State-Purdue game and the Ohio-Florida Atlantic games, and that's just because we don't know if each team played well, played poorly, or what their average game really looks like. The whole point of the model is to get an idea of how each team will perform if they play their average game against the competition. So as we get more data throughout the season, we can expect the model to get better and better, which is part of the exciting aspect of this. On that note, for Penn State, we now have data where they played a pretty good opponent in Purdue. I believe they're ranked around 28th now nationally, especially after a big win this weekend. And then after also playing Ohio, a lower-level FBS team, where I think they played a pretty good game. They exceeded their score by 11 points that I had predicted. So I think that they had a pretty good game. I think that's partly due to matchups as well, since they tend to succeed when they can run the ball, as they did this past weekend. Auburn, meanwhile, it's kind of difficult with this modeling to really tie in the significance of FCS data. More often than not, if you put up a lot of points against an FCS team, all that yardage is going to translate into the model as, in Auburn's case, a really strong performance. But it's kind of hard to relate that to FBS. Typically, you're going to put up a lot more yards in games against FCS opponents, as Auburn did in their first game of the season, as opposed to last week against an FBS opponent. So we'll get into that and get into some adjustments in the model on how I'm perceiving that data to pertain to this game. So getting into it, last week we saw PSU kind of got back to having a good run-pass balance. I'm kind of taking this as they've had one good game against Ohio. I know Ohio is, kind of ranked in the bottom 30 teams of FBS, but I think that 46 points for Penn State is still useful data. Ohio definitely was in the game. They were able to kind of control PSU, but then large plays or, PSU would just have big hits on yardage from passing or from rushing that I think really kind of brought them ahead there. And then on the defensive side, they were just able to shut down Ohio, and that I think really gave them an advantage. So I think for PSU, what we saw more notably is the passing was their main attack for the game, in addition to the running. But I think the passing is what's going to be moving forward. If you recall the Purdue game, the run game was fairly absent, as I think a lot of people expected it to be again this year, as they're still kind of retooling that O-line. I think it's minorly better than last year. And they do have some good backs, but I think they've just been unable to utilize them this season as they were last season, although I do think the situation is getting minorly better. Overall in that game, I think it's Penn State's offense and defense both played really well, especially in stopping the run, which Penn State is going to need this coming week. Just looking at the stats, Penn State, 338 yards of passing. I think that's pretty typical for them. I would probably expect it a bit more, although they did, bring in the backups who totaled for over 100 yards. Also with rushing, Singleton had close to 200 yards, and for the team it was 234, which is really an above average, if not outstanding showing against, I think, a somewhat competent defense in Ohio. I'm expecting that number to be a lot lower this week. Getting into the flip side of things on Auburn, Auburn's rushing, as I said, Penn State put up 234 yards against Ohio. Auburn playing maybe a slightly better team in San Jose State. I think that's up for debate, though, at this point in the season. Auburn put up 210 yards of rushing, but for passing, they only had 168 yards. Watching the game, it looked like their offense is still kind of figuring things out. I think San Jose State played a better game than I expected, especially on the offensive side. I really thought Auburn's defense would shut them down in that game, but there were a few times where Auburn's middle linebacker, especially in the first half, was just caught out of place, and San Jose State would just throw a quick slant, get the ball out of the quarterback's hands before Auburn could really hone in on the rush and turn that into yards. So I thought that was interesting, just from a defensive standpoint, as Auburn, I think this year, they're maybe not quite where they were in previous years as far as their defense has been, but I think they're still a good defense, probably they're probably top 25 in the country. And that being said, as I look through their stats here, they still really didn't give up many yards through the air, which I think is what kept them in that game. So I think it's more so the offensive struggles, maybe a bit with scheme since it's still early in the season, that kept this game close to the kind of amazement of some. But give credit to San Jose State. I think Auburn did have the tougher opponent this week, so I wouldn't look too much into this game just being a one-score game. So with that being said, the takeaways I think for each team so far heading into this game is that Penn State is going to be pass heavy. They might have something in the rush game that they've figured out, though it is hard to say against Ohio. They're going to be playing a much better defense than Auburn. What stands out with Auburn through the season so far as we get into the stats is their yards per pass so far is just over 8.5. I think that's largely due to their competition. Meanwhile, Penn State's is actually about at 7.7 yards per pass, which is pretty close, and they played much more difficult teams. Auburn's yards per rush are at 6.3. Meanwhile, Penn State's are at 5. But I think if you take into account the quality of defenses they played, the argument can be made that Penn State's rush is actually better. I know 5 maybe isn't a great number given they played Ohio last week, and it looks like they averaged about 7 yards per carry, which I don't expect them to get against Auburn. But that being said, I wouldn't be surprised if Penn State actually outrushes an opponent or a top 50 level opponent for the first time in what at least feels like a while. So getting into the model, the model right now has this game picked at Penn State at about 23.5 and Auburn at about 19.5. That being said, that model, or the scores from that model, are using all of the data, the FBS and FCS data in Auburn's case, with a strength of schedule weight calculated in there. And I think that's where this game, or at least picking this game, really comes down to the strength of schedule that Auburn has, or lack thereof, in the teams they've played. What you see when you look at the model is that Auburn is predicted to outpass, and Penn State's actually predicted to slightly outrush Auburn. It's about a tenth of a yard difference in the model, and for the pass, it's about just over a yard in Penn State's favor. I've also used kind of adjustments for strength of schedule on those statistics, and when you apply those, Penn State is actually predicted to have to average in excess of 1 yard per rush over Auburn, and for pass, the numbers come out to be kind of silly, but it's about 3 to 4 yards more per pass. I don't know if I would take that to be something that will actually happen. I don't think it will, just because I really think that this Auburn defense is going to give Penn State some problems. When you look at, their pass yards against per game at 236, that's pretty good, if not really good. And their rush yards against per game, I think, is really indicative of their schedule, but it's at 64. So that's largely why I did the adjustment for the expected PSU yards, particularly for rushing. So that being said, I'm going to get into some pathways on how I think Auburn can win this game. Unlike last week, I really think this model's pretty spot on. If you look right now, the spread in Vegas is a 3-point Penn State favor, and this model is right at 3.02 when you get down to the decimal points. So that being said, we're going to look at how we think Auburn can win this game. I think it's also worth noting, I think the spread's actually going to be a little bit greater in Penn State's favor, and that's largely due to strength of schedule. After watching that San Jose State game, I really question Auburn's ability to score consistently, and I also question Penn State's, especially after that Purdue game, but I think Penn State figured some things out last week. And that's why I have this game at about a one-score difference for my pick, just after looking at the data. So for Auburn, I think that their best path to win is to really just have a good defensive front. In the past, we've seen that give Penn State struggles. I think slightly to somewhat above average Purdue defensive front really gave Penn State fits in that game, even though they were still able to put up 35 points. So I think if Auburn can apply that, you never know. We might have kind of like a Penn State-Illinois situation if things go really bad for the Nittany Lions out there in terms of schemes. So also on that note in matchups, I think this is a bad matchup for Penn State. And while I do still have them picked to win by a score, I think Auburn's lack of offense so far tempts me to actually put this pick at about more of a 10-point game in Penn State's favor, which might sound crazy, but their offensive numbers against not very good teams and arguably air in week one, I don't think is going to translate well. I think this Penn State defense is very good, as I also mentioned in my last video. So I think that's going to give Auburn struggles. So for now, I think it's a one-score game, 27-20 Penn State, and I think that this is just largely due to the fact that they're more of a proven team. For Auburn, we don't know if last week was good, bad, the other. If this is kind of the average game for Auburn, I don't think it is. But if it turns out to be, then I think that this game could definitely be greater than a 7-point spread. So with that being said, thank you so much for watching. If you'd like me to do any other game predictions, leave it in the comments. And please like and subscribe. And I'll see you guys next week for week 4.